In the town of Dustvale, they called her the Widow Girl, and every time they said it, it sounded like a curse. The winter of 1874 didn't just bring snow, it brought a heavy, pressing silence. It smothered the town, choked the color from the sky, and left a bite of hunger in every gust of wind. Through this white wasteland walked Mary Callahan, a ghost in a threadbare shawl, with her 3-year-old son, Elias, clinging to her leg. His cheeks were raw from the cold, but his eyes held a trust that broke his mother's heart. He was too young to understand shame, but he was learning it fast. He clutched a small wooden horse, the last thing his father ever carved for him. A year. It had been a year since they buried her husband. Trampled by a wild stallion, he was trying to break for a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood paid for the coffin, nothing more. Since then, Mary had become a phantom, sweeping floors and mending clothes for scraps, sleeping in barns when she had to. The women of Dustvale whispered she was bad luck. The men looked at her with a different kind of hunger, one she feared even more than the cold. So she learned to keep her head down, her voice a whisper, her very presence an apology. But Elias was hungry, and his hunger was a roar she couldn't ignore. So she found herself pushing open the door to the one place with a fire burning bright enough to be seen from the edge of town. The saloon. The air hit her like a fist, stale whiskey, sweat, and cheap tobacco. Laughter and a screeching fiddle filled the room. Elias buried his face in her skirt. She took a breath, held it, and let it out slow. "I'll wash for coin," she said, her voice thin but clear. "Dishes, floors, anything." The room went quiet, then a single barking laugh cut through the silence. "Well, look what the blizzard blew in," a man with a greasy beard shouted, slapping his knee. "Come to scrub our sins away for a nickel?" The room exploded in laughter. Another man, his grin missing 3 teeth, raised his glass. "Careful, boys, she charges extra if her tears get in the washwater." Mary's hand tightened on Elias's shoulder. He looked up at her, his little voice a heartbreaking whisper. "Mama, why are they so loud?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she walked to the nearest table, piled high with dirty plates, and started to work. The saloon keeper, a man with eyes like chips of ice, just shrugged. It was a shrug that said he didn't care where the labor came from, as long as it was cheap. All night she scrubbed, while Elias slept on a pile of coats near the stove, the little wooden horse clutched tight in his hand. But as she worked, she felt a pair of eyes on her. Not like the others. These were quiet, steady, watching her from the darkest corner of the room. It was Joseph McGraw, the rancher from the northern ridge, a man the whole county respected and feared. A widower, just like her. He sat alone, his drink untouched, just watching. Then, as quietly as he'd been sitting there, he got up and left, melting back into the storm. Mary finished her work just before dawn, her hands raw and bleeding. The saloon keeper tossed 2 coins on the bar. It was barely enough for a loaf of bread and some milk. As she stepped back out into the biting wind, she saw a dark shape near the door. A burlap sack. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a thick wool blanket, a small bag of dried apples, and a block of cheese. There was no note, no sign of who left it. But she thought of the quiet man in the corner. Joseph McGraw. The man the whole town whispered about. The man whose own wife had died years ago, leaving him alone in that big, empty house. They said he was cursed, that he couldn't father a child. They said he was a man made of stone, but stone didn't leave blankets for a freezing widow. The whispers followed Mary like a shadow. The sack of goods didn't go unnoticed. At the general store, the baker's wife, a woman with a face like sour milk, leaned over the counter. "Getting gifts now, are we?" she sneered, her voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Some men have a taste for charity cases." Mary's face burned, but she kept her eyes on the floor, paid for her bread, and left. The laughter of the other women followed her out the door. She knew what they were thinking. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a temptress, a schemer. She was using her son to trap a lonely man. The thought was so absurd, it was almost funny. Trap him? She was just trying to survive. But in a town like Dustvale, a woman's reputation was all she had. And hers was turning to mud. A few days later, a boy came running up to her, breathless. "Mr. McGraw needs a cleaner," he said. "He sent for you." Hope and fear warred in her chest. The McGraw Ranch was the biggest in the county. It meant steady work. It meant food for Elias. But it also meant stepping into the very heart of the storm she was trying to outrun. She had no choice. She took Elias by the hand and walked north, toward the sprawling ranch that sat on the ridge like a silent king. The house was bigger than any she'd ever been in, but it was cold, not from the winter, but from a deep, settled loneliness. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight. An empty nursery on the second floor had its door slightly ajar, a tiny rocking horse sitting motionless in the center of the room. A chill ran down Mary's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Joseph McGraw gave her instructions in a low, quiet voice. He never looked her directly in the eye. He was polite, but distant. A wall of grief stood around him so high she didn't think anyone could ever climb it. While she worked, Elias, filled with a boy's endless curiosity, slipped out of the house and wandered toward the barn. The smell of hay and horses was a powerful lure. He toddled into the vast, dim space, his little boots making soft prints in the dirt floor. Joseph was in there, currying a massive chestnut mare. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his broad shoulders hinting at a strength that was more than just physical. He didn't seem to notice the boy at first. Then, Elias did something that changed everything. He held up his little wooden horse. "Horse," he said, his voice clear as a bell in the quiet barn. Joseph stopped his work. He turned, and for the first time, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, landed on the child. Elias stared back, unafraid. He took a hesitant step forward, and then another. He stopped right in front of the giant of a man, looked up into his face, and with all the simple certainty of a 3-year-old, he said a single word. "Papa." The curry comb fell from Joseph's hand, clattering on the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. Joseph froze, his face a mask of shock and something else, something that looked like a deep, shattering pain. Mary appeared in the doorway, her own heart pounding with fear. "Elias, no!" she cried, rushing forward. "I am so sorry, sir. He doesn't understand." But Joseph didn't seem to hear her. He knelt, his big frame trembling slightly, and stared at the boy. It was as if he was seeing a ghost. Without a word, he reached out and gently touched Elias's cheek. The boy didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch. Joseph's throat worked, but no sound came out. His eyes glistened. He wasn't made of stone after all. He was made of something that had been broken a long time ago. And her son, her little boy, had just found the cracks. From that day on, something shifted. Joseph never mentioned the incident in the barn, but he was different. He started leaving a bowl of hot stew on the table for her when she finished her work. He spoke to Elias, his voice soft, asking him about his wooden horse. He even carved a tiny, perfect saddle for it, out of a scrap of leather. Mary watched them from the kitchen window, her heart a tangled mess of gratitude and terror. This kindness was a dangerous thing. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. One step forward could mean salvation, or it could mean a fall that would break them both for good. The town, of course, noticed. The whispers grew into a roar. "She's got her hooks in him now," the baker's wife declared at the mercantile. "Using that poor child as bait. She'll be living in that big house before the snow melts, you mark my words." The looks Mary got were no longer just scornful. They were filled with a venomous hatred. They saw her as a parasite, a disease threatening to infect their most respected citizen. One evening, as a new blizzard raged outside, Mary was scrubbing the floor when she heard a loud banging on the front door. Joseph went to answer it. It was Silas Blackwood. the man who owned the stallion that had killed her husband. His face was red from the cold and whiskey. "McGraw," he snarled, "I came to warn you. The whole town's talking. You're letting this woman make a fool of you." Joseph stood in the doorway, blocking Blackwood's view of Mary. "What I do on my own land is my business, Silas." "She's trouble," Blackwood spat. "Her husband was a no-good drifter, and she's worse. Get rid of her before she ruins you." Joseph's voice dropped, becoming as cold as the wind. "Get off my property, now." Blackwood hesitated, his eyes darting past Joseph, trying to catch a glimpse of Mary. He opened his mouth to say something else, but something in Joseph's stance, something hard and unyielding, made him think better of it. He turned and stomped off into the snow. Joseph closed the door and leaned against it, his eyes closed. Mary stood frozen, the scrub brush dripping onto the floor. He hadn't defended her. He had only defended his property. The fragile hope in her chest shriveled and died. She was just the help, a problem to be managed. The next day, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay. She couldn't put Joseph in this position, and she couldn't raise her son in a town that hated them. She packed their few belongings into a small sack while Elias slept. She wrote a short, simple note for Joseph, thanking him for his kindness and leaving it on the kitchen table. With tears freezing on her cheeks, she picked up her sleeping son and stepped out into the pre-dawn cold. She would walk to the next town, or the one after that. She would do whatever it took. But as she reached the end of the long driveway, a figure on horseback emerged from the swirling snow. It was Joseph. He dismounted, his face grim. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice rough. "I can't stay here," she whispered, clutching Elias tighter. "I won't be the woman who ruins you." He took a step closer, the snow crunching under his boots. "And what about him?" he asked, nodding toward Elias. "What about what he wants? He's a child. He wants a father. I can't give him one." Joseph's expression softened. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her name. "My wife. Her name was Annabelle. We tried for years to have a child. The doctors said it was impossible. The empty nursery. It was for the baby we never had." He looked down at the ground, his voice thick with a pain that was still raw. "When she died, this house, this land, it all became a tomb, until you and that boy showed up." He looked up, and his eyes met hers. "When he called me Papa, it was like the sun coming out for the first time in 5 years. Don't take him away from me." Mary stared at him, speechless. This wasn't about pity. It wasn't about charity. It was about a shared loneliness, a shared ache for a family that had been stolen from them both. But before she could answer, another rider appeared, coming fast. It was the sheriff, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 other men from town, including Silas Blackwood. "McGraw," the sheriff called out, his face hard. "There's been a complaint. The town council has decided. This woman is a vagrant and a moral danger. She has 24 hours to leave Dustvale." Blackwood smirked from behind the sheriff, a look of triumph on his face. This was his doing. He had turned the town against her, weaponized their judgment. Mary's blood ran cold. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was official. They were casting her out. Joseph stepped in front of Mary and Elias, shielding them with his body. "On what grounds?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "She has a job. She has a place to stay. Right here." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about that, Joseph, and you know it. It's about what's proper. A widow and her child, living under your roof. It ain't right." "It's my roof," Joseph said, his voice ringing with authority. "And she is under my protection." Silas Blackwood laughed, a nasty, grating sound. Your protection? You think you're the king of this county, McGraw? You're just a sad old man haunted by ghosts. This town has rules. He spurred his horse forward, pointing a gloved finger at Mary. And she is breaking them. She's a stain on this community. Elias, woken by the shouting, started to cry. Mama, I'm scared. That little boy's cry did what all the shouting couldn't. It broke through the anger and hit something deeper. Joseph looked from the crying child to the hard-faced men in front of him. He looked at Mary, her face pale, but her spine straight, her arms wrapped around her son like a shield. And in that moment, he made a decision. You want to talk about rules, Silas? Joseph said, his voice dangerously calm. Let's talk about the rule of law. You want her gone? You'll have to go through me, and the law says you can't just throw a woman and child out into a blizzard. She's not your wife, the sheriff mumbled, looking at the ground. Joseph's gaze didn't waver. Not yet, he said, the words hanging in the frozen air. He turned and looked directly at Mary, his eyes asking a question that made her heart stop. The sheriff and his men stared, dumbfounded. Silas Blackwood's face contorted with rage. He had pushed, expecting Joseph to fold. Instead, he had forced his hand. Joseph reached down and took Mary's hand, his grip firm and warm. He looked back at the men. She and the boy are staying, as my intended. Now, unless you have a warrant for my arrest, I suggest you leave. The sheriff looked at Blackwood, then back at the unmovable figure of Joseph McGraw. He knew he was beaten. He grunted, turned his horse, and rode away, the other men following meekly behind. Only Silas Blackwood remained, his eyes burning with a furious hatred. This isn't over, McGraw, he hissed. You'll regret this. Then he wheeled his horse around and galloped off, swallowed by the snow. The silence that fell was profound. There was only the sound of the wind and Elias's quiet sobs. Mary looked at Joseph, her mind reeling. His intended. He had said it to protect her, of course, a lie to save them from the storm. But the way he was looking at her now, the way he was still holding her hand, it didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a promise, a crazy, impossible promise made in the middle of a blizzard at the edge of the world. Come inside, he said softly. It's cold. He led her and Elias back toward the house, back toward the warmth. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they had just delayed the inevitable, but for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. The storm was still raging, both outside and in the town. But inside the walls of the McGraw Ranch, a tiny, fragile fire had been lit. The house was no longer just a house. It was a fortress. Joseph's public declaration had stunned Dustvale into a temporary, simmering silence. The whispers didn't stop, but they were quieter now, laced with a grudging respect for a man who would not be moved. Silas Blackwood, however, was not silent. He made it his mission to poison every well, to turn every friendly face against them. He told people Joseph was losing his mind, bewitched by a conniving widow. He reminded everyone of the tragedy of Joseph's first wife, twisting the story to make Joseph sound unstable, even dangerous. A man who couldn't keep one wife safe is now bringing another into that cursed house, he'd say at the saloon, buying rounds for anyone who would listen. Mary heard it all. The words found their way to her, carried on the wind like bitter seeds. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her work, on making the lonely house feel like a home. She aired out the dusty rooms, polished the dark wood until it shone, and even dared to open the door to the empty nursery, letting the sunlight stream in. She and Joseph fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. They were not lovers, not yet. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy, and a shared affection for the little boy who now followed Joseph everywhere, his chatter filling the silent halls. Elias blossomed. With Joseph, he learned to identify bird calls, to track rabbits in the snow, and to ride on the front of Joseph's saddle, his small hands gripping the pommel with a fierce joy. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias asleep on the rug between them, Mary finally found the courage to ask. "Your wife," she said softly. "Annabelle. Blackwood says. He says you couldn't protect her." Joseph stared into the flames for a long time, his face carved in shadow. "Annabelle was fragile," he began, his voice low, "as delicate as a prairie rose. She wanted a child more than anything. When the doctor told us she couldn't, something inside her broke. She got sick, a fever of the mind, the doctor called it. She just faded away. There was nothing I could do." He finally looked at Mary, his eyes filled with an ancient, weary pain. "I have spent 5 years blaming myself, thinking that if I had been stronger, richer, if I had taken her to a city doctor, maybe she would still be here." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and real. Mary's heart ached for him. "It wasn't your fault, Joseph," she whispered. Sometimes things just break." He nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "When Blackwood talks about her," he said, his voice hardening, "it's not out of concern. He and we've been rivals for years. He wants my land. He wants the water rights to the creek that runs through my southern pasture. He thinks if he can ruin my name, he can force me out." Suddenly, a cold knot of dread formed in Mary's stomach. "My husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was working for Blackwood when he died, breaking a stallion." Joseph's eyes narrowed. "I remember," he said, "a wild brute of a horse. Blackwood said your husband was reckless." "He was a good horseman," Mary insisted. "The best I ever knew. He said the saddle felt wrong that day, but he needed the money so badly he rode anyway." A dark suspicion began to take shape in the room, a terrible, unthinkable thought. What if it wasn't an accident? What if her husband's death was just another move in Silas Blackwood's cruel game? The idea was so monstrous, so evil, that Mary felt dizzy. Joseph saw the look on her face. He stood up and began to pace, his mind clearly racing. "The land your husband was living on," he said, "that small plot by Miller's Creek. After he died, who did you sell it to?" "I didn't," she said, confused. "I couldn't. I didn't have the deed. It was lost. Blackwood offered me $50 for it, but I couldn't sell what wasn't mine. He got angry, said I was a fool." Joseph stopped pacing. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a new, terrifying light. "Mary," he said, "Miller's Creek doesn't run through my land. It runs through yours." The puzzle pieces slammed into place with a sickening crash. Blackwood didn't just want Joseph's land. He wanted her land. The small, seemingly worthless plot her husband had claimed, because it held the key to the water. He hadn't been trying to drive Joseph out by ruining his reputation. He was trying to drive her out. Her husband's death, the town's scorn, the campaign to label her a vagrant. It was all part of a plan to get her land for pennies on the dollar. "He killed him," Mary breathed, the words tasting like poison. "He killed my husband." The grief she had carried for a year was suddenly dwarfed by a hot, surging rage. Joseph came to her, kneeling in front of her chair. He took her trembling hands in his. "We don't know that for sure," he said, his voice steady, "but we're going to find out." Their alliance had been forged in defense. Now it was forged in a quest for justice. The next morning, Joseph rode into town to speak with the sheriff. He explained his suspicions, laying out Blackwood's motives, the water rights, everything. The sheriff, a man named Miller who was more weak than corrupt, shifted in his chair. "That's a heavy accusation, Joseph. You have any proof?" Mary's word. Her husband was a skilled rider. A man's skill can't save him from a wild horse and a grieving widow's memory. It can play tricks. I need more than that to go up against a man like Silas Blackwood. Joseph left the sheriff's office in a cloud of frustration. The law wouldn't help them. They were on their own. He knew he needed to find proof. Something tangible. He started by talking to the men who had worked for Blackwood over the years. Most were too scared to talk. Blackwood paid well, but he ruled through fear. Finally, Joseph found an old farrier, a man named Jeb, who had recently been fired by Blackwood in a drunken rage. At first, Jeb refused to speak, but Joseph was persistent. He sat with the old man in his dusty workshop, sharing a bottle of whiskey, talking about horses and hard winters. Finally, Jeb's resolve cracked. "I saw it," he mumbled, staring into his cup. "The day Callahan died. I saw Blackwood in the stables, near the stallion's stall. He was messing with the saddle. I thought it was strange, but I didn't dare ask." Jeb looked up, his eyes filled with shame. He had a knife. "I saw him nick the cinch strap. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough so it would give way under pressure. He murdered that boy, Mr. McGraw, as sure as if he put a gun to his head." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. Joseph felt a cold fury rise in him, unlike anything he had ever known. He now had a witness. It was time to confront Blackwood, but a direct confrontation would be dangerous. Blackwood was a cornered animal, and he would lash out. Joseph needed a plan. He needed to expose Blackwood not just to the law, but to the entire town. He needed to turn Dustvale's judgment, the very weapon Blackwood had used against Mary, back on its master. The annual spring cattle auction was just 2 days away. It was the biggest event of the year. The entire county would be there, including Silas Blackwood, who loved to preen and show off his prize stock. It was the perfect stage. Joseph went to the sheriff again, this time with a proposition. He didn't tell him about the witness. He knew the sheriff was too cowardly to act on it alone. Instead, he played on Miller's pride. "I'm going to call Blackwood out at the auction," Joseph said, "in front of everyone. I want you there, Sheriff, not to make an arrest, just to keep the peace. Let the people of this town hear the truth and decide for themselves who they believe." The sheriff, seeing a way to look important without taking any real risk, agreed. Mary was terrified. "It's too dangerous, Joseph. He's a snake. He'll hurt you." "He hurt you more," Joseph said, his voice gentle but firm. "He took your husband. He tried to take your home and your dignity. This ends now." He placed his hands on her shoulders. "I made a promise to protect you. I intend to keep it." The day of the auction dawned bright and clear, a full spring that did nothing to warm the chill in Mary's heart. The town was buzzing with energy. Ranchers and their families filled the main street. Mary stood with Elias near the back of the crowd, her heart pounding against her ribs. Joseph stood near the auctioneer's platform, calm and resolute, waiting. Silas Blackwood arrived in a show of arrogance, his prize bull preening in a pen. He was laughing, shaking hands, the picture of a respected community leader. The auction began. When Blackwood's bull was brought up, the bidding was fierce. Finally, the auctioneer slammed his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Silas Blackwood for $500, he shouted, as Blackwood had arranged with a friend to buy his own bull to drive up its perceived value. As the crowd applauded, Joseph stepped forward. "I have a bid," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd went silent. All eyes turned to him. "I bid one truth." Blackwood's smile vanished. "What kind of foolishness is this, McGraw?" Joseph ignored him, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I want to tell you all a story," he said, his voice resonating across the square. "It's a story about a greedy man, a man who wanted a small piece of land so badly he was willing to do anything to get it. He needed its water, so he arranged for the man who owned it to have an accident." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's face was turning a dark, blotchy red. "These are lies. He's a crazy old man," Joseph continued, his voice never rising, but gaining power with every word. This greedy man then tried to drive the man's widow out of town. He turned her neighbors against her. He used your own fears and prejudices to do his dirty work for him. He convinced you that a desperate, grieving woman was a threat, all so he could steal her land. He paused, letting the words sink in. He pointed a finger directly at Blackwood. That man is Silas Blackwood, and the widow is Mary Callahan. He murdered her husband for a water right. "Liar!" Blackwood screamed, his composure finally shattering. He lunged toward Joseph, his hand reaching for the pistol on his hip. But the sheriff, for the first time in his life, did his job. He and two other men grabbed Blackwood, holding him back. "You have no proof," Blackwood shrieked, struggling against them. "It's your word against mine." "Not just his word," came a shaky voice from the crowd. The old farrier, Jeb, pushed his way to the front. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. "It's my word, too. I saw you, Silas. I saw you cut the cinch strap." The crowd gasped. The accusation, coming from one of their own, was undeniable. The whole story was laid bare for them to see. Their own cruelty, their own blindness, manipulated by one man's greed. The faces that had once looked at Mary with such scorn now turned on Blackwood with a unified, righteous fury. They saw him for what he was, a murderer and a coward. They saw Mary for what she was, a survivor. And they saw Joseph for what he was, a hero. Blackwood, seeing the hatred in their eyes, finally broke. He stopped struggling, his face slack with defeat. The sheriff, emboldened by the crowd, finally snapped handcuffs on his wrists. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice filled with newfound authority, "you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Callahan." As they led Blackwood away, a path cleared for Mary. She walked through the silent crowd, her head held high for the first time, and went to Joseph's side. He took her hand. Elias ran to them, wrapping his arms around both their legs. "Papa Joseph," he said, his voice bright and happy. "You won?" Joseph smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He looked at Mary, and in his gaze, she saw not just protection, but love, a love that had been forged in hardship and proven in a crucible of fire. The people of Dustvale watched them, no longer a scandal, but a family. The whispers were finally, truly, silent. The spring that followed was real. The snow melted, the prairie bloomed, and the town of Dustvale began to heal. They held a wedding in the small white chapel. The whole town came. Mary wore a simple dress, but she looked like a queen. Joseph stood beside her, the lines of grief erased from his face, replaced by a deep, quiet joy. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, a profound silence filled the church, a silence of respect and atonement. After the ceremony, they stepped out into the bright sunshine. Joseph leaned down and whispered in her ear, "I believe that empty nursery has been waiting long enough." Mary's heart swelled with a happiness so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She was no longer the widow girl. She was Mary McGraw, a wife, a mother, and she was home. They had faced down the storm and found the sun on the other side, and they knew, standing there together, a family forged in the harshest of winters, that they could face anything the world threw at them, as long as they faced it together. The fire beneath the snow had finally burst into a brilliant, warming flame. What do you think really motivates people to judge others so harshly? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that uncover the truth hidden in the shadows.